Hi there, this is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, and welcome to another episode of Double Take. And the two films we'll be looking at today is Village of the Damned from 1995, directed by John Carpenter, and Village of the Damned from 1960, directed by Wolf Ferrella. Both films are based on the book by John Wyndham, The Midwich Cuckoos, but they take slightly different paths with the same story, and they're kind of quite interesting to compare and contrast. The 1960 film stars George Sanders, so obviously I'm a bit biased because George Sanders is fantastic, and Barbara Shelley, who's always wonderful as well. You'll be used to her in Hammer films. The 1995 John Carpenter film stars Kirstie Alley and Christopher Reeve. He includes a couple of Carpenter regulars, Peter Jason and George Buck Flower, and Mark Hamill, old Luke Skywalker himself, turns up as the town's minister. It tells the story of an event that causes all the townspeople to collapse and black out for a short period of time, and then in the following weeks and months they realise that quite a lot of women in the town have become pregnant or fallen pregnant, which is always a bizarre phrase, and then they all have children, and they all look a little unusual with their blonde hair and their propensity to take revenge on people who wrong them and have a singular mind, and they can do mind reading and all manner of things on the people of the village. Now, even the name of the village, the Midwich, to me sounds a little bit Lovecraftian, and obviously Carpenter had did In the Mouth of Madness with Sam Neill the year before, which is one of the most Lovecraftian non-Lovecraft films ever made. I mean, as much as I love John Carpenter, let's be honest, In the Mouth of Madness is probably the only really good film he made after 1988. And I will start the video pretty much by saying I prefer the original for several different reasons that we'll perhaps get into. The original is only 77 minutes long, but it's well paced. It gets to where it needs to go. The Carpenter film is not that much longer. It's 90 odd minutes. But the first 20 minutes from the event to Kirstie Alley and the FBI turning up, or some government agency turning up, to the pregnancies, to the kids being born, it's like all in the first 20 minutes. And it like races through it to the birth of the kids. Again, this is a bare bones Blu-ray release, so it's only a trailer. Most of John Carpenter Blu-rays have a commentary from Carpenter, so I don't really know what his vision was, because sometimes, even though he's you would say a relatively successful filmmaker, a lot of his films had kind of studio interference with them. So for example, his Memoirs of an Invisible Man with Chevy Chase, which is an enjoyable little film. He wanted to go kind of down a darker road with it. There is a little bit of kind of existential dread in the film, and that's when it's at its most interesting. But the studio, because it was Chevy Chase, they wanted more broad comedy, and that's why that film is a little uneven. So I don't really know the production history of Carpenter's Village of the Damned, as far as, was it originally meant to be a longer film with kind of better characterization, or was this what he wanted to do? But it seems just so rushed to go from the event happens, everybody blacks out, to yeah, the babies are born, they're a bit strange. Whereas the 1960 version, again, it's only 77 minutes, but it takes its time, so you do get a kind of sense, a better sense of creepiness, back to some of that existential dread. And the children are born a bit later into the film, and as they become 3 months, 5 months, a year old, it seems a more natural kind of flow, and it's just better handled and better kind of dealt with than in the remake, which does seem a bit rushed in the first 20 minutes. There's slight kind of role changes. There's less characters in the original film. George Sanders and Barbara Shelley are a couple who've been trying for a child for ages, but because of the age difference and various other reasons it hasn't quite happened. And then obviously she becomes pregnant, so George Sanders is really happy. In the remake, their story is pretty much involving another couple, Michael Parry and Linda Kozlowski. They've been struggling to have children, and then she becomes pregnant. Christopher Reeve and his wife, obviously they become pregnant too. I mean, I'm not going to pick on Christopher Reeve, but there's not a lot of comparison with Christopher Reeve and George Sanders. And George Sanders, who plays a professor in the 1960 film, he's kind of chosen to teach the children because he can kind of keep emotion out of it, and he can be more analytical and scientific about things. Whereas Christopher Reeve later in the film is chosen to kind of teach the kids about emotion and being human. So there's a kind of different kind of tact between the two characters. There is really no Kirstie Alley equivalent in the original film. She has been following these colonies, because in both films we learn that this isn't the only town it's happened to, it's happened round the world. So she has the history of this and she's been following it. And then we kind of find out in the remake, what the exact origins are. One of the reasons that I like the original is the fact you don't really find out everything about the children and why they're a little bit strange. You can obviously guess, but it's not like explained excessively. There's a couple of really beautifully creepy scenes in the 1960 film where adults, one guy almost knocks down one of the children by accident, and another guy tries to shoot them, and they get their comeuppance, or the revenge by the children, is shot in a very creepy and unnerving way. Those two incidents are in the remake, but they're not handled as well or shot as well, and there's more adult deaths in the remake, but sadly, instead of being creepy and unnerving, a couple of them are actually quite laughable. and one of them is quite ridiculous. You know, in the 1960 film, the driver who almost hit one of the girls, you know, was forced into a trance and goes back into his car and drives his car into a brick wall, killing himself. In the remake, the same character essentially drives off into a field, and there just happens to be a massive tank of fuel just sitting in a field, and he drives straight into it, and of course the whole thing explodes. And it's just like, okay, that's not silly. There's a couple of effective deaths, but the majority of them are actually not shot or handled very well, and it does actually come across as being a bit funny rather than actually being creepy or scary. The children in the second one, they do try something quite interesting. One of them is perhaps not of the same mind of the other one. He changes his hairstyle, so he's got a different hairstyle than the other one. He kind of, the other ones, sorry. He kind of questions what's going on with the other children, whereas in the original film they're just all uniform. I should say another reason for me why the original is better, the lead child in the 1960 film is played by Martin Stevens, who was the unbelievably creepy little boy in The Innocents from 1961 with Deborah Kerr. And he's suitably creepy in this one, whereas the kids in the Carpenter film, again, I think part of it because it's in colour, the obvious wigs, and they're just not as effective as in the black and white film, but maybe that's just me. And again, their leader doesn't really stand out the way Martin Stevens stands out. Of course, I should actually say, yeah, The Innocents was actually after Village of the Damned, which was 1960, and The Innocents was 61, so this was actually before he was creepy in The Innocents. He cornered the market on creepy kids. It's a shame The Omen wasn't made earlier, and you could have had the triumvirate of creepy children. So both films are worth your time, especially the 1960 film. The Carpenter film, if you're a Carpenter fan, then yes, I would watch it and pick up because it is canon. It's Carpenter canon. But like I said, it's not his best work. Because again, like I said, after They Live, his films are fairly slim pickings, apart from In the Mouth of Madness, I would say. But it's just interesting. You know, the remake tries a couple of different things, which you have to give it credit for. But overall, it's just not as atmospheric. It's not as creepy. It's not as thought-provoking as the original. But again, I don't know how much studio interference. Perhaps somebody in the comments can enlighten me on that. You know, because who knows, there maybe could have been longer characterization in the first 20 minutes, but the studio wanted to get to the weird kids quicker. We all know what studios are like. So thanks very much for watching this double take of two Villages of the Damned. Please leave comments below which one you prefer. Some of you might prefer the John Carpenter film. And hopefully we'll see you again for more double takes and more videos. This is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films saying farewell.